Anyways, we're at our start time right now. So I'll give you a proper introduction, Dr. Salsman. So thank you everyone from both the Gannon chapter as well as the Penn State chapter. We are happily joined here by Dr. Richard Salsman of Duke University. He's an assistant professor of political economy. He's the founder and president of Intermarket Forecasting Incorporated, a senior fellow at the American Institute of Economic Research, and a senior scholar at the Atlas Society. He's also the author of 5 books. We are very glad to have him deliver his talk about why capitalism is the ideal habitat for humanity. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Richard Salsman.
Kevin, thank you. And I understand we have 90 minutes. I'm not going to talk for 90 minutes. I think that's the first good news you'll hear tonight. So I'm looking at the clock. I have a clock in front of me. I'll try to get my comments out. I do have a presentation that I'm sharing on screen. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Kevin at Penn State. Thank you, Abby at the Atlas Society for organizing this as well. Turning Point US, all the people involved in this. Thank you very much. I've been teaching at Duke now about 7 or 8 years or so, but I've been studying environmentalism and capitalism for decades, probably 3 or 4 decades. So I'm an old guy, but hopefully here to give you a new perspective. The Habitat for Humanity, you know, is an organization that actually builds housing, affordable housing for people. So I'm playing off that phrase a little bit. I actually love the phrase. And over the years, I've come to recognize the relationship between capitalism and environmentalism. And it's begun to strike me that, that capitalism is a habitat of a sort. There's a lot of anti-capitalism out there. So there's a view that it's not good either for the planet or for humans. So I wanted to give an alternative view tonight, an alternative view that I've been suggesting all over campuses and various places in the last few decades. By the way, if anyone wants these slides, all you have to do is write to me at richard.salsman.duke.edu. Pretty straightforward. I have a lot of slides here. I'm going to skip over some of them quickly. But at the end of it, if you think, you know, I really want to see those slides, because I also have links and footnotes and graphs and charts and things like that. If you want them, if you're at that level of interest, just email me at Duke and say capitalism slides or green slides, however you want to put it, and then I'll send them to you. Well, if you look at this picture, it's a picture of a fish out of water. And that common phrase, fish out of water, everyone knows what it means. It means trouble ahead for the fish because the optimal habitat for the fish is water. So that's what comes to mind when I see a picture like this. I worry about this little goldfish. Where's he going? He's leaving his optimal habitat. Now, what's interesting is even if you break it down into fish that like freshwater and fish that like saltwater, a fish would not even be in his proper habitat if it was a cold water fish thrown into the ocean. So there's all levels of complexity here, but this is the theme I want to deal with tonight. This picture right here, a species out of its optimal environment. And I believe that's what humans are if they're outside of capitalism. So it's likewise, to me, it's likewise for humans. We too, as a species, have an optimal habitat. And we need a humane habitat. Now I'm playing off the word human here. Human is Homo sapien. Sapien, by the way, means thinking being, thinking animal. And that's what Aristotle decades, centuries ago said distinguishes us from all other species. We're the reasoning, conceptual faculty animal. But we too, I contend, and it's not too controversial for me to say this, have a habitat that we not only survive in, but live well in, flourish in. Now, here's another dramatic kind of, let me just jump to the chase, so to speak. If I said to you, carbon footprint, meaning impact of the human species on some habitat, it's something that people want to diminish today in the environmentalist movement, right? They want to diminish and reduce our quote unquote carbon footprint. Well, here is a satellite image of Korea. And the contours of Korea are shown because it's a satellite image at night. Now, I want to show you this because from one philosophic perspective, the North is a raging success, and the South is a complete failure. But from another context, it's the opposite. So now keep this in mind now. If your view was the carbon footprint should really be limited, if necessary, maybe even eliminated, if that's your perspective, which is a perspective among some deep philosophic environmentalists, North Korea is the ideal part of the peninsula. There's almost no footprint there. You cannot see any electricity. There's a little piece there you can see, I think, in the capital, but the rest of the country is dark at night. People are literally in the dark at night in North Korea. And now go south and you see, well, there's Seoul. It's very bright around Seoul, the capital, because the lights are on, the electricity is moving, cars are driving around, things like that. Now, there's a big footprint, there's a human footprint in the south. There's almost no human footprint in the north. Now, which country is more successful? From a certain criteria, you could say North Korea is successful. Limited human impact, limited human influence, very visibly seen in the North Korea section, and the opposite for South Korea. Now, if you want development, if you want electricity, if you literally want the lights on, you would say South Korea is the ideal situation, and North Korea is a disaster. North Korea is a complete barbaric, literally Dark Ages type system. So keep that in the back of your mind as we move on through this. Now, here's a recent book, very famous, not famous, very, very popular among some of my students at Duke and elsewhere. Naomi Klein, Capitalism versus the Climate. So this is very relevant to my talk tonight. Now, just some excerpts here to get a sense of what Naomi is arguing. She says, the things we must do to avoid catastrophes, catastrophic warming, are no longer just in conflict with the particular strain of deregulated capitalism that triumphed in the 1980s. For those of you who know the 1980s, that was Ronald Reagan and neoliberalism. They are now in conflict with the fundamental imperative at the heart of our economic model, grow or die. Now that's interesting. She's saying capitalism basically says grow, 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 prosper. She doesn't like that. If given a choice between grow and die, which side is she picking, really? That's weird. Quote, by posing climate change as a battle between capitalism and the planet. See the assumed contention there, the assumed antagonism? I'm not saying anything that we don't already know. The battle is already underway and capitalism is winning, unquote. Gee, as a capitalist, I actually wish that were true. But capitalism is actually losing this battle. Quote, this means defending those parts of society that already express values outside of capitalism. Now, what would those be? Notice her list: an embattled library, a public park, a student movement demanding free tuition. Wow, actually, that is anti-capitalism. What's that all about? Students wanting freebies? Students who are crony moochers off the taxpayer? That is certainly not capitalism, but why is Naomi Klein worried about that? Why is she on the side of mooching students and freeloaders? Very odd. Quote, the free market capitalism of the past 3 decades has put the emphasis on consumption and trade, but we have to remake our economies to stay within our global carbon budget. You mean like North Korea? To stay within that budget? Quote, we need to see less consumption, less trade, less private investment. Wow, she seems to be against economic growth. Quote, these reductions would be offset by increased government spending. What? So we're not going to produce anything anymore, but the government will spend money taxing people who don't produce anymore. What is this economic model? Quote, implicit in all this is a great deal more redistribution, unquote. Notice the emphasis then. Capitalism is ruining the planet. Therefore, we need to produce less. And as we're producing less, we need to redistribute, which means steal and redistribute, the shrinking pie. This is a very, I submit, this is a very grim assessment But based on what? What is this based on science? Is this based on ideology? Here's a quote below from Larry Bell from a book critical of Klein and others. Is this true what he's saying? The obsession with stopping climate change, quote, has little to do with the state of the environment and much to do with shackling capitalism and transforming the American way of life in the interest of global wealth redistribution, unquote. Possibly, Larry Bell, possibly, yes, there's something to that. And here's an excerpt from my recent book. I hope you'll look at it, read it. History shows, I'm going to just read this into the record. I don't like to read PowerPoint slides typically, but since this is being recorded audio as well, I thought I would just read this into the record. This is straight out of the book. History shows that social systems exhibit varying degrees of liberty and tyranny, wealth and poverty, happiness and misery. Life is fueled by liberty, wealth, and happiness. Death is fueled by tyranny, poverty, and misery. To live best, we have to know what social system is best. Every living organism has an optimal habitat, a setting in which it best survives and thrives. An opposite or inhospitable habitat can prove harmful, even lethal, to a species. Think fish out of water. Humans are no exception to the general principle. Our specific nature decrees that we too have a preferred habitat. Aristotle distinguished man as both the rational and political animal, meaning our best habitat allows the free exercise of our mind and free interpersonal relationships. That's what I call a habitat for humanity. Now, capitalism, I contend, and there's a lot of argumentation that has to go into this, so I don't want to be seen as just asserting something. There's volumes that have been written and could still be written about this to validate the principle. But I quote myself here, quote, capitalism is proved to be the most hospitable habitat for humans. But what is it exactly? What is capitalism? And more interestingly, why do so many humans oppose it? If it's the optimal habitat for humanity, why would humans hate this habitat? It's very odd. Now, it could be because I'm wrong. It could be because it's a very bad habitat for humanity. It's detrimental to human welfare, and therefore people hate it. If it were, I'd hate it too. I'm pro-human. But why isn't capitalism winning wide acclaim? Well, put it this way. Why is it so hated? It's not just not gaining adherents. It's losing adherents and gaining haters. Oh, I'm not quoting myself anymore. All right, here's the quote now. Humans have free will, and if they're equipped with reason, they can elect to achieve great things and scale great heights, surpassing, as we know, all other species. But having no pre-programmed guide to good living, humans do not automatically choose what's best. As I said, they have free will. They can choose wrongly. Unlike other species, humans can actually choose to be self-destructive. Instead of being rational and cooperative with their own kind, they can sometimes choose to enslave, to rob, or to destroy them. Now, I'm arguing tonight that capitalism is the optimal, and capitalism, by the way, only, is the only optimal habitat for humanity. Here in this slide, I just want to suggest to you what I would call the pillars of capitalism. Now, I have whole chapters and pages on this in my book, but here I just want to give it to you in succinct bullet form and what its opponent systems are. The opponent systems are largely called statism, but they take different varieties, which I'll show you in a couple minutes. But if you go bottom to top in this graphic, here are the essential differences. And again, lots of volumes can be written on this. Lots of argument and debate is necessary. Capitalism is based on reason and objectivity. It's based on human beings practicing their key skill, rationality. It also depends heavily on egoism and self-interest, that you have to be the primary beneficiary of your own actions. Some detractors call this greed, but even detractors of capitalism admit this system is egoistic. This system is something where the emphasis is on advancing yourself, promoting yourself, having self-esteem, having self-responsibility, having self-motivation. And it doesn't mean the Nietzschean view of running roughshod over others. What else? I'm going up the list here. Individualism, that the individual is all important, that we do group together sometimes, but only for mutual benefit to mutual advantage. But the individual is very important, and the individual must not be sacrificed for the benefit of others or groups or races or ethnicities or gender. But even the critics know this. They'll say it's too individualist. Capitalism is too individualist a system. Okay, moving on up into more political stuff. The egoistic individualist system has to involve private, notice it relates to individuals, private ownership and control, not only of our own bodies, but of the means of production. And not only of the means of production, but the products of production, personal products. And even critics here, know this. The critics will say, yes, that's the problem. It's private ownership and control of the means of production. So much of what I'm saying here shouldn't be that controversial. It's only an issue of whether you have a consistent case for capitalism. And unless you have a consistent case in all these dimensions, you won't have a consistent case for capitalism. All right, what's the next level? Rights. We have rights. What are rights? Ayn Rand years ago said they're moral principles defining and sanctioning our freedom of action in society. You got to have these things. You got to have rights so you know where the proper spheres of action are. You can't let people violate your rights. What are the rights? The right to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. That's it. That's a small list. It's a big list, though. It's an important list. Life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. Easy to remember. There's no right to healthcare. There's no right to housing. There's no right to education. Why? Because other people have to provide those things. They're not your slaves. They're not your serfs. You need to pay them for those things. You have no right, as Bernie Sanders says, to healthcare. There are healthcare providers who need to be paid. They too have rights. You can't have a right to violate other people's rights. And then finally, constitutionalism. Some people think capitalism means anarchy. Some people think capitalism means no government. It doesn't mean that at all. Capitalism means a constitutionally limited government, a government whose sole purpose is to protect rights. That's it. That's its sole purpose, to protect legitimate rights. How? Three things: police, courts, and a military. That's it. Nothing beyond that, nothing less than that, that would be anarchy. Nothing more than that, that would be statism. I'm not going to go through the list of statism and the counterparts, but notice over on the right, there are counterparts on every single level: philosophical, political. Statism has a different answer. They don't care about reason. They care about surmise, which means to make up stuff and believe things without evidence. They believe altruism is noble, self-sacrifice. They believe in collectives. They believe in groups. They don't see you as an individual. They see you as a member of a group. It's politics, identity politics. They don't believe in private ownership of the means of production. They want public ownership. They want government ownership. They don't think you have rights. You only have duties. Duties to serve others. Duties to serve the state. Duties to serve the planet. Duties to serve anything non-human. And the politics of it, totally authoritarian. Authoritarian. Not liberty advancing, but liberty restricting. This is a really very big difference in two kinds of systems. Now, are there variants of statism? Yes. The next slide is showing variants of statism. I only give you 3 variants here, but there's really many. This matrix, I think, can be helpful to you figuring out what are we talking about when we talk about capitalism, when we talk about feudalism, when we talk about fascism, socialism. Is Bernie Sanders a socialist? Is Obama a socialist? What is conservatism? What is that saying about capitalism? Why are some libertarians uncertain about whether they should defend capitalism? The terminology can get really crazy and really confusing, but I think this matrix will help you. Notice what this matrix does. It basically says, let's categorize 4 distinct systems as how they think of ownership and control. Now, over on the right, I say ownership and control, maybe not just of the means of production, which is the standard economic stuff, but what about ownership and control of your own body? ownership and control of your own mind. Capitalism, if you look here, is in the northwest quadrant. Why? Because it's private ownership and private control. You own yourself, you decide for yourself. You own your company, you decide for yourself. You own your family, you decide, not some public school board. Notice the opposite, socialism. Even the socialists will admit this. They'll say, yes, we want public ownership and public control of everything. But now they've had it, and there's like 25 historical experiments of this, complete disasters, complete inhumane systems that impoverish, maim, and kill millions of people. Now, what is fascism? Interestingly, fascism is a hybrid. Fascism is not both public ownership and control. It's a mixture. It's private ownership, but public control. It's the government saying, we're not going to nationalize you, dear business, but we're going to tell you what to do. We're going to make you woke. We're going to make you, by our pressure and other means, do our bidding. That is what Mussolini came up with in Italy. That's what Hitler copied in Germany. That's fascism. We are moving toward fascism. America is moving away from capitalism, which it was moving toward in the 80s, and it's moving toward fascism. It's not actually moving toward socialism, because Biden and Obama and all these people and Hillary, they're not really saying nationalize industry. They're saying completely control industry. Feudalism, I'll just skip here. It's just more of a historical curiosity. Now back to environmentalism, climate, and stuff like that. Look at this chart. This is a poll of teens in America. What do you think about climate change? 57% afraid, 52% angry, 43% helpless, 42% guilty, only 20% are uninterested. This is really interesting to me. Afraid and angry, guilty? Okay, let me just focus on afraid and guilty. Why would more than half of teens be afraid of climate change? And by the way, psychologists will say the best way to control people, other than literally coercing them, is to make them afraid. And then also make them guilty. And then you can tell them to do anything you want. So why is this happening? Why are teens, who are soon to be my students at university, so afraid and guilty about climate change? Now, literally, not about the end of the world, or the world is ending, or the world is being polluted. The climate is changing. That's what they're afraid of. And here's the lovely Greta. Greta tells the world, I'll never forgive you for failing on climate change. She's angry. This is an angry girl. She's very angry. But who's promoting this anger? Here's another fearful and angry person. AOC, very angry, very sure of herself, very scared. The world's going to end in 12 years if we don't what? Address climate change. What does that mean? Address it. She means stop it. Stop climate change, or the world would end in 12 years. I don't know where she gets the 12, but I have seen in the literature 12 comes up a lot. I think if you say 2 years, it sounds like you'll be wrong in 2 years. If you say 22 years, people won't keep track of it. So there's some kind of sweet spot, 12 years. This has been going on, I figured, for 5 decades. 5 decades ago, I found forecasts of the world's going to end in 12 years unless we get rid of capitalism. I don't know where they get the 12 years, but it's they're counting on Americans like forgetting the forecasts. The forecasts always are wrong. Here's John Kerry saying, by the way, even if you get rid of all CO2 emissions, it's not enough. The US and China could go to zero emissions and it won't solve the climate crisis. What is the climate? What is the climate crisis? What is the crisis? And now if the quote unquote green czar, I don't even know what that means, green czar, is saying, you can do all this and it doesn't matter. We're going to hell in a handbasket. It's really weird. Now look at what I've highlighted below. This is from a quote from the Newsweek article. This week, Biden will assemble 40 world leaders for a virtual climate change summit. The goal of the summit is to reach deals to help the planet in reach of what? 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The limit that scientists have set for staving off the worst impacts of climate change. Pre-industrial? Focus in on that. Pre-industrial. You know what pre-industrial means? Pre-industrial means pre-1750. The Industrial Revolution started in 1750 or so. Why is the ideal or the target a pre-industrial level of CO2 emissions? That is very curious. That is very nefarious. That's weird, because it sounds like this is an anti-industrial revolution movement. I'll say more about that later. For those of you, by the way, who don't know the history, and unfortunately I'm old enough to remember it, when I picked up Time magazine, look at these ones, in 1979, I was 20 years old. Now look at the cover, The Big Freeze. Time 1977, The Big Freeze. They did it twice. 1973, The Cooling of America. Guess what the danger was? Global cooling. So the environmentalists were predicting, look at the one on the left, from Science and Mechanics, a new ice age is coming, a new ice age imminent, 1969. So the big talk then was, watch out, global cooling. And guess what the prescription was? Get rid of capitalism. Capitalism is causing industry, economic growth is causing global cooling, is ruining the planet. Get rid of it. But just wait a decade or so, because now the heat is on. Global warming, Arctic meltdown. Business Week, Time, wherever you go. This is what, 1987, 2000, 2001, 2004. The whole thing switches to global warming. And the solution, get rid of capitalism. The Industrial Revolution, capitalism is causing global warming. It caused global cooling, and then it caused global warming. But then guess what? The data changed again, and there was neither global warming or cooling. There was neither for subsequent decades. So guess what happened? Climate change. The problem is not cooling or warming, but changing. This is very weird. Now we're against the climate changing. Why? Well, we didn't really predict well that it was cooling, and we didn't really predict well that it was warming. This is embarrassing. Let's just say we don't want it to change. Then our forecast will always be true. And since it's changing all the time, there is no end to our crusade against capitalism. We don't have to worry about whether our forecasts are right or not. Now we have to stop climate change. So from cooling to warming to change, what is going on here? It's like someone's moving the goalposts. Only since they do it over many decades, it's not always obvious what the hell is going on. So I ask here in a question here, is environmentalist fundamentally radical or instead reactionary? Is it against change? That sounds like a conservative. I thought they were progressives. I thought they were change agents. I thought they welcomed and loved progress and change. But here it looks like they are really against change. They want to get off the world that is moving, progressing, growing, changing. They're against change. They're conservative. They're fearful phobics about change. This is the climate for thousands of years. This is a chart of global temperatures from 2500 BC to roughly now. There's a lot on here, but the only thing to conclude is the climate always changes. Always. And it has some warming moments, it has some cooling moments. By the way, rational human beings and scientists put this chart together because they came up with something called carbon dating and a whole bunch of other things. No animal could do this. Only humans could go measure what the temperature must have been thousands of years ago. The point of this chart is, can you find any period where there was no climate change? There isn't any period of no climate change. So you have to ask yourself, why is the current ideal no climate change? It has literally never happened. It's never happened, but some people want it to happen. No climate change. By the way, a lot of these years are way before the Industrial Revolution. The norm is no climate change. That's the norm. Climate change is the norm. And yet a whole social, economic, political movement wants no change in something that has always changed. That to me is not following the science. That is just crazy. It's almost like saying, I am going to stop the tides coming in and out. Do you know anything about where tides come from? No, I just want to stop the tides. I'm just tired of the change. What if someone said to you, you're a climate denier? You hear that now, don't you? You're a climate denier. I mean, just break that down. What does that even mean? Here's my 8-point analysis. I'm not going to go through all of this, but no one denies the climate. There is no such thing as a climate denier. The climate exists. That's point one. Everybody knows a climate exists. So there's no such thing as a climate denier. But now, what if you say, you're a climate change denier? I don't even think that's true. Everybody knows that there's something like this going on. The climate changes. So let's stop dismissing people because they're a climate denier or they're a climate change denier. No, they're not. So notice the levels you could go at here. You could say, the climate doesn't exist. That's false. Or the climate never changes. Point two. That's false. Now we're getting complicated here. Number three, humans and other factors cause climate change. Okay. Yeah, that might be true. Next level, four, only humans cause climate change. I don't know about that. The evidence does not show that humans are the only cause of climate change. Look at number five. The causes and effects of climate change entail a net cost to humans. Does it? Who examines that? Almost nobody examines that. But notice my standard. My standard at number five is it good or bad for humans? Even if humans affect climate change, what if it's good for humans? What if a warming planet, for example, creates more vegetation, which makes it possible to feed more humans? If you're a humanist, that's a good thing. And further down, notice number 8, the claim, humans can substantially or should stop or curb climate change. Now that, compared to number 1, which is undeniable, number 8 is very deniable. If you get down to number 8 and say, humans can stop climate change, that is the craziest, most unsubstantiated claim ever. And yet that's what the policies are now based on. And how do they get to those policies? By accusing you of number 1, accusing you of denying that the climate changes. It's a big ruse. You need to look through it. Boy, look at this global warming. I don't see any upward trend, do you? This is the US heat wave index. There's no increase going on. Global warming, they say. Here's where there's no climate change. I love it. I'm sitting in a room right now at 72 degrees. There's no climate change. There's no climate change here. Outside, if it gets hotter or colder, my temperature gauge keeps it at what they call room temperature. This is what capitalism delivers. Capitalism delivers no climate change within the rooms you're sitting in right now. Isn't that very cool? It's very cool. That's the kind of climate constancy I love. But it's due to capitalism. It's due to air conditioning. It's due to various ways to change and alter your indoor climate, including humidity, by the way. Number of homes with air conditioning in the US. Up, 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 up. This is good stuff as far as I'm concerned. But the environmentalists would oppose this. Why? Because air conditioning is technology that requires energy. It requires electricity. It requires fossil fuels. And so they're not really for constant climate because they're against air conditioning and all these other things that would heat homes. But this is a capitalist achievement here, these charts. More and more internal air systems modulated for the benefit of humans, so they don't have to freeze or swelter inside their abodes, or their cars, or their shopping malls, or their classrooms, or anywhere else you might be sitting today. Let's go back in history. The environmentalists are very much like the Reverend Malthus. If you know anything about the history of political economy or demographics, Malthus was the one who said, you know what, capitalism is not going to work. It's going to produce an insufficient amount of food. Population growth will outstrip food growth, and people will die en masse. This is the first environmentalist of the last 200 years, Malthus, to the point where his name was actually attached to something like the Malthusian trap. What's the trap? There's no way you're going to be able to produce food enough to support all humans. He was wrong, terribly wrong, crazily wrong. Here's his essay from 1798, and look what happened right after the essay. This is a measure of GDP per capita. It just took off. It took off after the Industrial Revolution. He could not see what was coming. So he had some pretty bad forecasts. He had no idea that capitalism might apply itself to agriculture, to massively increasing the productivity of agriculture. Size of the world population, right after Reverend Malthus, skyrocketed. When he wrote, there was 985 million people on the planet. Today, there are 7.7 billion. Why aren't they all starving? According to Malthus, they must all starve. This is the beginning of a very bad track record for what amounts to environmentalists. At the time, he would not call himself an environmentalist, but we might call him someone who has no clue how economics works, no clue what it means to increase productivity, no clue what it means to apply industry and science and other things, in this case, to the problem of creating food. Let's get a little more philosophic now. One of the reasons capitalism is so wonderful is the 3 Ps. This is why it's become an amazingly proper and propitious habitat for humanity. Number 1, it believes in private property. 2, it has a price system. 3, it has a profit motive. Every single one of these is good for the environment that I call the human environment. And philosophically, by the way, let's just make a side note here. When I say humans and the environment, I mean humans in their environment. I don't mean humans as unnatural things standing outside the environment. So I reject the idea of humans versus the environment. Humans themselves have a particular environment that they need. It is not humans versus the planet. It is not humans versus the atmosphere. Humans are natural things that are part of nature. And there are specific species of a specific kind, I've already said that. But there is no clash, as environmentalists assume, between humans and this habitat that's necessary. Now, why is property so important to hold this thing? If you own private property, you protect it, you care about it, you cultivate it, you think of it in a long-term fashion, unlike things you don't own or rent. Everybody knows this. They care for and cultivate and think long range about the stuff they own, and less so about the stuff they do not own or rent. That makes them want to preserve their resources, treat them well, cultivate them. Second, prices. If the price of stuff is left free, guess what happens? If you start running out of stuff, what happens? The price goes up. What would a producer do? Go find more stuff. What would a consumer do? Conserve on the use of those things. The price system of capitalism, left to function, make sure that there's a proper focus on producing, generating the right kinds of resources. If you don't have this, you're going to wreck your system. You're going to have what's called a tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is when property is privately owned and people don't have free prices to guide them on what to use and not to use, the whole system goes haywire. Now, here's the most controversial part: profit. What is profit? Everyone believes that profit and the profit motive is destroying the planet. It's the exact opposite. Profit is making stuff with the most minimum input possible. That means companies are motivated to use as few resources as possible to make the products they sell. GM making a car. What does a car consist of? You know, glass and upholstery and metal and rubber and a whole bunch of things, right? They will make more money if they minimize the costs of the resources they use to make the thing. That means they preserve resources way better than any environmentalist could possibly think of. Back to some history. How is this possible? Look at this history. This is 200 years, basically of the Industrial Revolution, basically of capitalism, which didn't exist prior to 1750. So here the chart starts in 1820. Number of people living in extreme poverty. For a while it was flat and then it went down. The number of people not living in extreme poverty just skyrockets. What is this? This is the liberation of the planet. This is the Industrial Revolution getting people out of poverty, getting people out of extreme poverty. Very humanistic, very humanitarian, but totally driven by greedy, profit-seeking companies. This is a percentage of the two. You look at this decline. Number of people, percentage, I should say, percentage, proportion of people living in extreme poverty. It plummets. It plummets from 90% down to 30% in the last 200 years. Who could oppose this? Who could be against the Industrial Revolution? Who can want an energy mix, which, as John Kerry said, is pre-industrial? Per capita GDP, 5 nations. I picked 5 that are prominent today. That's a hockey stick. Is that not a hockey stick? It's a hockey stick. Nothing happened for 800 years. Basically no growth from 1000 AD to about 1700 AD, so 700 years. And why did it skyrocket after that? Because we got the Industrial Revolution, but because we got the Renaissance, we got the Age of Enlightenment, we got political revolutions restricting the power of monarchs and others and saying, let us free, let us choose, the consent of the governed, let us laissez-faire, which means let us alone, let us produce stuff. Guess what? People produce stuff. Annual death rate from natural disasters. If you asked an environmentalist, they would say it's getting worse. It's worse. Extreme temperature, extreme weather, terrible, terrible. Not true. This is a declining chart. It's declining. From 1920s to 30s to 40s, the number of deaths from natural disasters has plummeted. I don't know what these teenagers are fearful of. They don't see charts like this. By the way, Our World in Data is a fabulous website for a bunch of data. So let's go with the facts here, people, not the emotions. Global natural disasters, death rates, all that down, 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 down. Why are people fearful? This is a wonderful performance. Global death rates from natural disasters also diminishing over time. The bubbles on the left are big, the bubbles on the right are very, very small. A bunch of things though: volcanic, droughts, mass epidemics, landslides. Look at all the stuff, that floods, wildfires, earthquakes, diminishing. Deaths are diminishing over time because people are more civilized. They're more advanced. They're wealthier. They're living in cities. The wealthier the country, the better the environmental performance. This is interesting. These are third world countries. Look at these countries. They're all third world countries. But there's a positive relationship between GDP per capita, that's on the bottom, and the environmental score, that's on the top. Wow. The wealthier you get, the better your environmental performance. That's interesting. You would think environmentalists would be pro-capitalist. They would be pro-wealth. They would want growth and prosperity and to improve the environment. But no, that's not their view. Why? The freer the economy, the better the environmental performance. Here I said the wealthier the economy. Here I say the freer. Wow. So environmentalists must want freer economies. They must want capitalist economies. No, they don't. They don't want freer economies. They want more socialism, more interventionism, more restriction. But why? This chart shows that the freer the economy, the better the environmental performance. So why aren't environmentalists pro-capitalist? It's a conundrum. There must be some other motive. Now let's talk about energy a little bit, and then I'll wrap up and we'll go to questions. Energy, the energy mix, renewables, fossil fuels, nuclear energy, that whole thing. Very much, right? Very much part of the environmentalist argument. Well, let's just admit here, for humans, what is the optimal energy? We need to ingest food and drink, and maybe vitamins and stuff like that. That's what we ingest, and then we emit waste to live. Well, here's the key. What is energy as we know it today? It's the sustenance for machines. That's what it is. Why do we have oil and gas and coal and nuclear power and electric? To propel machines. We don't ingest these things. Our machines ingest these things. Without these things, our machines don't move. They don't work. They don't operate. They shut down. Well, if you oppose all the things, and I've listed them here, these are the things environmentalists oppose. Whale oil, logs, windmills. Well, solar they allow, hydro maybe. Steam, coal, gasoline, crude oil, electricity, natural gas, nuclear power. They do support the earlier ones, don't they? Why are they against the food that drives and fuels machines? Could it be that they're against machines? Could it be they're against capital or capitalism? These are the things that fuel machines. So if you want to starve machines, if you want to stop capital, this would be the best way to do it. You need to get rid of the energy sources that uniquely drive our current modern industrial system and support 7.5 million people. Notice what I asked down below. If in contemporary times, some people prefer a near exclusive reliance on pre-industrial energy types, that might imply a latent opposition to industrialism. It might imply a wish to return to pre-industrial lifestyles, pre-industrial livelihoods, pre-industrial lifespans. And by the way, pre-industrial lifespans were 25 years. We now live 75 years. Is this progressive? Is it futuristic? Or is it rather quite conservative, quite regressive, quite nostalgic for a world where there's no industry and there's this kind of agrarian period, a Garden of Eden type? The health effects of energy production. The more energy that's produced, our health goes up. Wow, do environmentalists tell you that? No. Look at this energy mix. What was used in 1800? Mostly non-fossil fuels. Look at this, 1.7% was the fossil fuel mix in 1800, but the 1800 economy was crude and backward compared to today. Now, if you go down this list, we are using more and more fossil fuels, but the economy got more and more modern. I mean, look at nuclear. Nuclear only kind of starts showing up in the 1950s, 60s. Even now, nuclear is only 4% of the global energy mix. And the non-fossil fuel, the fossil fuel mix has gone up. But so why the animosity toward fossil fuels? It has supported the growth and prosperity of the world economy in the last 220 years with no demonstrable harm to the environment. If by that you mean water and air. The cleanest air and water are in pro-capitalist countries. I'll skip a little bit here. Look at this chart though, 1775 to now. Look at this stupendous increase in energy consumption. It totally fueled the Industrial Revolution. It totally fueled the increase in our standard of living, in the extension of our lives. Who could oppose this? Electricity production since 1950. Where did it come from? It mostly comes from fossil fuels. If you're against fossil fuels, you might be against electricity production. But if you're against electricity production, you're looking for brownouts and blackouts. Is that what people want? Skipping ahead here a little bit, why not nuclear? This is a litmus test. You can ask any environmentalist. If you're worried about CO2 emissions, if you're worried about global warming or global cooling, whatever, why wouldn't you go nuclear? Nuclear has virtually no CO2 emissions. And yet they're anti-nuke. Nuclear does have to deal with waste and stuff, but so do solar panels have to be buried after 20 years. What about the waste from solar panels? What about the waste from windmills and turbines that they last 20 years? What do? Bury them after that? Where they have waste issues as well. Nuclear waste has been handled very carefully, very safely for 50 years. That's not the issue. Nuclear accidents, far fewer people have been harmed by nuclear accidents than by all the other things that nuclear could replace, including crude oil, offshore drilling, coal, the creation of even the creation of solar panels and other. Kill way more people than nuclear. There's something weird going on here. If you oppose nuclear, you seem to be opposing anything that might fuel the future of capitalism. It could be that you're just against capitalism. Your concern is not CO2 emissions, humanity, things like that. Just a thought. Look at the fight against nuclear. Reactors under construction. Why did it peak in 1979? Why didn't it continue to grow? It's a wonderful, safe, almost unlimited energy source, and yet policy has fought it. There's a degrowth movement. You've probably heard of this. It's not just we don't want too fast growth because it's eating up the planet. We want degrowth. We want to shrink economies. And capitalism is the growth-oriented model. So we don't like capitalism. Why? Because it's the growth-oriented model. We want degrowth. Clive Hamilton is the biggest advocate of this. He calls growth a fetish. It's a sickness. It's a psychological sickness, he says, to want to have a growing, prosperous economy. Imagine someone saying this about your personal life. What are you trying to grow and add to your knowledge? What are you trying to build up your career? What are you trying to build up friends and grow and prosper and change? You're sick. You're psychologically sick. You should be looking for degrowth. You should be looking toward becoming less smart, not more smart, less loving, not more loving, less prosperous, not more prosperous. This is a sickness itself, I would argue. But it's been going around a long time. Here's Paul Ehrlich years ago saying, economic growth in rich countries is a disease. Economic growth is a disease. How do you cure the disease? You don't grow anymore. You shrink. You go back into the dark ages, like North Korea, where it's literally dark at night. There's a history here that might interest you. Ecology was the big word in the 60s and 70s. You know what they wanted? Clean air and clean water. Very reasonable, but also something that capitalism would deliver. Environmentalism is very different. Environmentalism is not, we need clean air and clean water. Environmentalism believes that humans are unnatural. That's the ism in environmental. They think humans are unnatural and that they despoil the natural environment. And then further, they think nature is intrinsically valuable. the earth is intrinsically valuable. Sometimes they call it existence value. But by intrinsic, they mean it's valuable apart from our evaluation of it. Now, think of what this leads to. The first premise is humans are not natural. The second premise is nature has intrinsic value, but humans aren't part of nature. And so humans are a cancer. Humans are an outside, despoiling, cancer-ridden, disease ruining, quote unquote, nature. There could not be a more inhumane and anti-human premise than this. But that's why they're so deadly. They literally believe humans should be heavily restricted and in some cases extinguished if they dare touch the planet. But that's the only way for humans to live. They have to touch the planet. I mean, animals and plants have to touch and change and gain sustenance from the planet. These humans do not think humans should do that. That is inhuman. These are just quotes from various people giving you the idea. Given the total absolute, here's Paul Taylor, a theory of environmental ethics, given the total absolute and final disappearance of Homo sapiens, not only would the Earth's community of life continue to exist, but in all probability, its well-being would be enhanced. Our presence, in short, isn't needed. If we were to take the stand of the life community and give voice to its true interests, the ending of the human epoch on Earth would most likely be greeted with a hearty good riddance. We have wished, student Brand, we have wished, we eco-freaks, for a disaster, for a social change that will bomb us into the Stone Age, where we might live like Indians in our valley with our localism, our appropriate technology, our gardens, our homemade religion, guilt-free at last. Lovejoy from the Smithsonian. These are not wacko group. These are like institutional. The planet is about to break out with a fever, and we human beings are the disease. There's many more. Let me just finish with Graeber here. Graeber, the U.S. National Park Service, Graeber. Human happiness and certainly human fecundity are not as important as a wild and healthy planet. I know social scientists who remind me that people are part of the nature, but it isn't true. Somewhere along the line, about 1 billion years ago, we quit the contract and we became a cancer. We have become a plague upon ourselves and upon the earth. And until such time that Homo sapiens decide to rejoin nature, some of us can only hope for the right virus to come along, unquote. A virus to come along to extinguish humans. That's what Graeber is hoping for. By the way, when the AIDS virus came up later, he said, this is wonderful. This might extinguish some people. Imagine what he must think about the coronavirus. Good stuff per Graeber. Kill humans. These are the humanitarian environmentalists. There's something called humanism, which is a love of humanity. It's an ethical, philosophic view that I hold that says humans are great, humans are wonderful, humans can achieve great things. They're the best animal out there. But there's also, be aware, misanthropy. Misanthropy is hatred of humans. And guess what? Only humans hate humans. I've never found a pet of mine, a dog, a cat, a giraffe that said, you know, I really hate humans. But humans hate humans. And environmentalists are big in this. They're big in misanthropy. They do not like humans, many of them. And if you're not someone like this, by the way, if you're just call yourself an environmentalist and say, you know what, I just want clean air and clean water. I say, thank you, you're not a misanthropist, you're a humanist. You care about clean air and clean water because you're a human. You expect humans to get clean air and clean water. And I would invite you to become a capitalist because that's what delivers this great habitat for humanity. And don't ally yourself with these misanthropes. Here's a misanthrope, a professor from Clemson in the New York Times a couple of years ago. Maybe it wouldn't be a great tragedy if we were extinct. Can you imagine anyone saying this about any other species? They would be fired that afternoon. They would be maybe killed. Here's a human saying it's okay if humans become extinct. Professor May is actually not a human in that regard. He's inhumane. So is the Pope. Why is environmentalism and religion so closely connected? Because it's not really a science. They're not following the science. Their emotionally hatred for capitalism is driving them. So the Pope's a greenie as well. It's crazy. So there's a lot of connection between, if you've noticed this, environmentalism and religion. Pantheism itself, by the way, means treating nature as God. Not as science, not as botany, not as zoology, not the earth as something that humans live in and should shape and mold to their benefit, but the earth as kind of like the Garden of Eden. Don't touch it. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge. Don't eat the apple. Don't be tempted, or we will punish you, just like God punished Adam and Eve. Pantheism. Weird, right? Nobody says pantheism anymore. Environmentalism is, a lot of it is pantheism. They're using a religious approach to the earth. Here's some alternative books you can take a look at that would give an alternative argument. Simon's interesting because he says, guess what the ultimate resource is? The human mind, reason, invention, scientists. That is the thing that gives us resources. And so you need to leave humans free to reason, function, research, experiment. We're not running out of things as long as the human mind is free, because it's the ultimate resource. That's what capitalism protects. It protects the thinkers and producers of the world. Some environmentalists have thought twice about what they've been doing and said, you know what, the whole thing is a fraud and I'm going to reveal it. And Lomborg is one of the best at this. Alex Epstein makes the case that fossil fuels are moral, not just economically sound, not just scientifically justified. There's a moral case for fossil fuels. Guess why? Because they help humans. Alex is a humanist. Alex is not a misanthrope. Alex is looking for ways to help humans so they don't become a fish out of water, meaning humans out of capitalism. Michael Schellenberger, now running for governor of California, I understand. But Michael's amazing because he was once an environmentalist and said, the whole thing is a fraud. I've been at it for 20 years, he said. And guess what? They think renewables can replace fossil fuels and drive the current world economy with 7.5 billion people. He does the calculations and he says, it's impossible. It's literally impossible. If you went totally to renewables, or even half to renewables, renewables are now about 3% of the global mix. He said, if you went to 50%, the population in the world that could survive is 1.5 billion. That means 70% of the population would have to go away because it's not supportable by renewables. I'll stop there. I think that leaves us 30 minutes. And again, I remind anyone who wants the slides, just write me at richard.salsman.duke.edu. So thank you for that. And should I turn it over to Kevin or Abby for questions or comments?
Yeah, we're happy to handle the Q&A. Thank you very much, Dr. Salsman. That was incredibly educational talk.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I would say it's very relevant to what we're seeing in modern politics with the climate alarmism that's out there, not only in modern politics, but we're seeing that pushed in classrooms, both at the university level and at the high school level. So thank you very much. So let me take a look at the Q&A, see what questions we have coming in. I know one question that I have is, what advice would you give to conservatives when talking to someone who is really, I guess, subscribed to the kind of climate alarmist thinking and believes that capitalism is the ultimate evil and it's going to lead to the destruction of the earth through climate change? So how would you approach a conversation with someone who believes that?
Well, other than what I just said, in the last other than the last hour. If I were to boil it down, Kevin, that's a really good. I mean, if you want, what do they call it? The elevator pitch.
Yeah.
What can I say in 15 seconds to this person? I think really the first thing you should say is, are you concerned about this because it's going to hurt humans? And then go from there, because notice how I focused tonight on a bit on humanism versus misanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
If you hear them say, no, I'm concerned about the status of human beings, then you start moving toward, that's a really good cleavage right there. And you say, well, at least this person is somewhat on your side, Kevin, assuming you're a humanist as well. Now you start talking about, well, what kind of systems historically have shown to be extending human life, extending human health, extending human happiness? You know, now you start bringing it into a discussion of the systems I talked about. And I'm telling you, it is not difficult to demonstrate and show that the freer, more capitalist systems have extended human life, have improved human hygiene, health, all these other things, gotten rid of diseases and stuff like that. And opposite systems, socialism, fascism, others, have really ruined human lives. So that's the where I would start, Kevin, because if their answer is, no, I think humans are unnatural. I think they're despoiling the planet. I think that you're starting, now you realize you're not talking to a humanist. You're not any longer talking to someone who is pro-human and just trying to figure out how to help humans. They're literally inhumane. They're literally anti-human. And the only way to approach them from there is just say to them, as a human, why are you anti-human? That's just leave it as an open question. I've done this, it really works. Sometimes I'll just say to someone, but you're a human, aren't you? And they'll say, yeah. And I said, so why do you think the human species is so evil? Well, you're part of the species. Is there something you're seeing that I'm not seeing that's making you doubt and despise and distrust and hate humans? It would be like a giraffe having a conversation with other giraffes, saying giraffes are awful. Giraffes are just terrible. What do you think, dear giraffe? I mean, it would be bizarre if we saw such a thing. I don't know if that helps, Kevin, but that's what I would suggest. Start with the humanist versus the misanthropy, and then know in the back of your mind and study it that capitalism is very pro-human.
Thank you very much. That's actually fantastic advice. So,
okay.
So we just had from the Q&A
yeah.
right here, question from, it's not saying the attendee's name, but I'll just have to read it as is. My question is, why is government necessary? ? You talk about a limited government that has only courts, police, and military. All three things have a free market solutions that don't require a state. So I believe that question is really, why is government necessary at all? The free market cover things, courts, the police, and the military.
Yeah, that's a good question. If you are an anarchist who say, well, we don't need government at all. Like, government is itself, well, how is it defined? Even Ayn Rand said government is a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within certain borders. That definition was not new to her. That was from Weber. Max Weber said that in 1920. So the anarchist argument is worth answering. Namely, why have government at all? I think the basic argument is that under anarchy, there is no way to control the irrational. That the irrational and the brutal will win out. In other words, might will make right. It doesn't really make right, but you know this. But physicalist, brutalist actions and people and groups will win out. So now here's the key, and here's why people are very suspicious of government. They don't really believe that when you create a government, you can create a government that behaves itself. And by behaves itself, I mean protects individual rights. But I think John Locke showed that logically can be true in the treatise on government. So read that, make sure you read that. Locke is saying, listen, I want this kind of limited government Ayn Rand's talking about, and here's a philosophic base for it. Now, if he had just said that, as he did and wrote that in 1690, and there was no demonstration of it, I don't think it would be believable. But the American founders actually created such a system. It had its defects and flaws, but for the first time in history, and this is where conservatives, libertarians, though the non-anarchist type, and objectivists should be very proud of the American founding, because Hamilton and the Federalists and others at the convention did construct a government that could behave itself, that did predominantly what I talked about, namely restrict yourself to defending individual rights, create this architecture of constitutionalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, all the things we know, the lattice work of how to protect individual rights. It is achievable. It's logically viable, a la Locke. It's functionally possible, a la Hamilton, Washington, and the founders. And we've lost it, but it isn't necessary to have lost it. The problem is not that all states must become statist. I think that's the anarchist assumption that's wrong. They assume, as Jefferson once said, I hate to say it, but Jefferson once said, under all sorts of government, under even free governments, over time, liberty necessarily yields, and you have to overthrow the government. I don't think that's true. I think his rival, Hamilton, showed that if constitutionally circumscribed, you can have a government behave itself. And now you have the rule of law. Now you have objective law. And it's still a powerful institution. There's no doubt about it. It's the one that has a monopoly on the use of force. But that force has to be circumscribed. And we're basically delegating to government our right to self-defense. It's a good question, though. I understand why people would say, Salsman, you think the government is out of control, so how about no government? I believe then force would be completely out of control.
All right, thank you very much. Let's get into our next question. It's going to be, I have friends in Europe who find it horrible that Americans do not have a government-funded healthcare system. What would be the best humane argument in support of America's healthcare system? Is there room for improvement in America's healthcare system from a human perspective?
Yes, the American healthcare system is the greatest in the world. Why is, even in 2022, why is it the greatest in the world? Because it's been more capitalist than any other system. Now, has it become more socialistic? It has, starting mainly in the mid-60s. So in the mid-60s, they adopted Medicare and Medicaid for government, for poor, Medicare for the elderly. The system has deteriorated since then. The government spending used to be in healthcare used to be something like 3 to 5% in 1960, and now it's something like 50 or 60%. So the US system is going the route of the European systems. I would argue that these Europeans who condemn the American system, they ruined their own systems. They socialized it. Britain had the National Health Service, I think began in the early 40s. They've wrecked the medical system there. They've totally wrecked it. They've ruined it. They've had what they used to call a brain drain in the 60s and 70s. What was the brain drain? Doctors, engineers, R&D specialists, pharma companies just left Britain. Why? Because they socialized the industry. Where are all the pharma companies now? They're not in Britain. They're not in Switzerland, France, or anywhere else. They used to be in those countries. They've all left. Now people hate pharma companies today. So they don't care. The people in Europe are quite proud. Socialists are quite proud that they ran all this pharmaceutical companies out of business and into America. Now, I would say, to the extent the American healthcare system is great and wonderful, it's only because of these vestiges of capitalism that still remain, the private hospitals, the private doctors, and things like that. But the system is definitely going toward the European model, and the European model is anti-capitalist. So there's much more to say about this, but I'll just stop there.
All right. Now, for our next question, I believe Zach wanted to ask this. Zach, you're on the call, right?
Yeah.
All right.
So the next question is that they asked what your thoughts are on the deregulated cryptocurrency market. Is it good or bad for the American economy overall?
It's good overall, not just for the American economy, but for the global economy. Now, just to be on the record here, I am an advocate of a complete separation of government from money. I don't think there should be central banks. I don't think the government should have a monopoly over money in any country. In the United States prior to 1913, that's exactly the system we had. We had no central bank and we had private banks on the gold standard. And the gold standard is not some kind of gimmick. It was something that historically, philosophically, logically, and for other reasons, people voluntarily converged on the gold standard. Now, today, the equivalent, I think, is the Bitcoin standard. It's going to take a while, but it is an alternative to government money. I think there are three competitors now: gold, crypto, and government fiat money. It's not really a competition in the sense that the last one's a monopoly. I mean, legal tender laws are laws that have the government force you to use their money. And so and they go out of their way, as you know, to make gold and Bitcoin hard to use. They'll tax it, they'll seize it, they'll block it. The governments of the world today are so out of control, and I mean at every level. I mean in America and in Russia. I mean in France and in Saudi Arabia. The reason they have seized the money and banking systems is because it's the only way for them to get resources without limit. The governments of the world today are growing beyond limit, and they cannot tax people because there'll be revolts in the street. So the reason they seize the money and banking system is it permits them to print resources without limit, without taxing people and other things. So that's why you see massive deficit spending, massive government debt issuance, massive money printing. They are basically bankrupt, these people. They have not made the case that people will willingly tax themselves and spend for these gargantuan welfare states. But back to your original question, that is the challenge. Bitcoin is basically private individuals trying to immunize themselves from this very awful fiat money and paper system. And I hope they succeed, but let's recognize that just as governments came to hate the gold standard, not because it didn't work, but because it handcuffed government spending, they're gonna say the same thing about Bitcoin. They're gonna wanna control it, limit it, criminalize it. So I'll stop there. I hope it succeeds and grows, but that's the challenge it faces.
The next question is, why are most college professors teaching from a European Karl Marx perspective?
That's a really good question. Being a professor in the universities, well, here's the good note. Before I answer that question, here's the good news. 100 years ago, if there were any Marxist professors, guess where they were? They were in the economics department. And guess what happened? The economics department, after a while, said, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. Go over to the poli-sci department. So then for many decades, the Marxists were in the poli-sci department. And then the poli-sci people realized, you guys have no idea what you're talking about, and you're not really scholarly. You need to go over to the sociology department. So then all the and this is in academia now. So then the Marxists ended up in the sociology department, but then even the sociologists, who are really not very good scientists, social scientists, said, you guys are fraudsters. This is just bogus. And by the way, by this time, we're seeing socialist experiments failing all over the globe. Guess where they ended up? They ended up in the literature departments, English departments. And I've always said that's a perfect settling point for them, because it's all about fiction. You know, now they're in the fiction departments where they really belong. That's a kind of snarky take on it, but it's a good news take, because no one in the major economics department of elite universities would say a nice thing about socialism. They really would, or Marxism, they really would not. So this is many ways a kind of a trailing indicator of what used to be taught decades ago, but it's still a problem. However, I would say in most departments today, even in elite institutions, you can get a mix of people who are pro-markets, neutral about markets, anti-markets, pro-capitalist, neutral about capitalism, sympathetic to socialism. But it's definitely balanced to the it's definitely skewed to the left. And the fundamental reason, I think, is because they hate, here's the root of it. Anyone who's anti-capitalism fundamentally hates self-interest. That's it. I would say that's true even of conservatives. Conservatives, if they want to be pro-capitalist, really need to reconcile themselves with the pursuit of self-interest. As the founders would put it, the pursuit of happiness. You can't be against that without ultimately being against capitalism. Capitalism really enshrines and rewards and applauds the pursuit of self-interest, the pursuit of happiness, loving life, really getting into life, not looking at an afterlife, looking at this life and loving this life. It's a pretty secular system when you think about it. So it's not just Marxists who are suspicious of it. Sometimes it's conservatives, and I implore conservatives. I beg conservatives, because I don't care about socialists anymore. They're not convertible. I beg conservatives to become more pro-capitalist and not say that it has to be religious, or that it has to be ascetic, or that it has to be environmentalist. I have met many conservatives who say, don't criticize environmentalism. And I ask them, why? And they'll say, because we have to conserve the planet. So they're true conservatives. I mean, they're conservatives not only politically, they have themselves fallen for the environmentalist myth that capitalism is not conserving the planet. It is not only conserving the planet, it's growing the planet. Capitalism is expanding the things we get out of the planet. Okay, I'm riffing a little bit here, so I'll stop. Sorry about that. That's too long an answer. Sorry about that.
Okay, the next question is, as a person who does not know much about any kind of economic strategy, including capitalism, do you have any recommendations for beginner books to read that would be good starting blocks to help me learn more?
Great question. All right, here's the three I would name. And if you're saying introductory, I'm going to give you introductory, not advanced material. Okay, so the first one, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal by Ayn Rand. Now, it's not just by Ayn Rand, it's her essay, A-Y-N-R-A-N-D, mid-60s. Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. It's not just her, it's other historians, psychologists, and economists like Alan Greenspan, who became Fed chairman later. That's a fabulous introductory book on capitalism's moral, practical, and political ideal aspects of it. The second I would name is Henry Hazlitt, who's written a book, who wrote a book years ago called Economics in One Lesson. It's a very short book, it's very succinct, but if you master that book, you will never be deluded by anyone making a stupid economic argument like minimum wage helps people, or rent control, really makes housing affordable, or a whole bunch of other, or trade deficits are terrible. Hazlitt smashes all the myths about markets and capitalism. And the last one, because it's more, and by the way, that one was 1979. So to give you something more modern, taking into account more recent issues, I have to plug my own book. So I have written a book called Where Have All the Capitalists Gone? That came out last year. So that one, if you read, you'll get a whole bunch of other sources. In addition to my arguments, you'll get a whole bunch of references to other pro-capitalist books, including the Rand book and the Hazlitt book. So I hope that helps. That's a good question. You need to know where to go for sources that professors will never give you.
All right, our next question is most of the support for climate action moral or scientific?
It's moral, but immoral in the following sense. Most of the climate activism goes something like this. Capitalism is evil. Capitalism is evil because it's based on self-interest. Because it's evil, it must have evil consequences. It doesn't actually have evil consequences, but I'm going to look for evil consequences wherever I can find them. Any change in the weather, any up and down in temperature, anything, literally anything that I can do. I'm paraphrasing here, the environmentalist approach, the alarm, as you call it, the alarmist approach. I will pin on capitalism, this evil thing that everybody admits is evil to begin with, right? So you couldn't get away with this unless there was a base premise that there's something wrong with capitalism's morality. Because face it, the economists have shown for decades, economists from all sides have shown capitalism produces the goods. Capitalism is enormously productive. That's not what they complain about anymore. They actually say it's too productive. They say it's too productive. Marx used to say it's not productive enough and it impoverishes the worker. Under socialism, we're going to have industry booming. The environmentalists today hate Marxism, in a sense. Their view is, we don't want the economy booming. We don't want industry. We don't want the labor labor unions and labor prospering. That's all terrible. That's all bad for the planet. But these people are not simply anti-capitalist. They're anti-humanist. They you know what I'm saying? They're not saying capitalism is exploiting the worker. They're saying capitalism is exploiting the planet. They've actually gone through a sequence. It used to be capitalism is terrible, but because capitalists are exploiting the worker. The second phase was, well, it's not really exploiting the worker because the worker is doing really great under capitalism. We need something else. Now what? Oh, it's exploiting the third world. So in the 60s and 70s, the shift was to, well, capitalism domestically might be good for workers, but it's doing this because it's exploiting the third world. Multinationals are running rampant over. And after a while, people realized, wait a minute, when capitalism spreads to the third world, people prosper. China showed that. When China liberalized after 1978, something like 700 million people were removed from poverty just by a small liberalization and a small degree of liberalization in China over the last 30 or 40 years. So now the third level is, well, it doesn't exploit the worker. It doesn't really exploit the third world. Let's try for it exploits the planet. That's what's happening here. It's an anti-capitalist premise. And there's a kind of confirmation bias there where everywhere they see disaster, they'll say capitalism did it. But if you dig deeper, the real reason they always pin the blame on capitalism is their premise is capitalism is immoral. Capitalism is evil. Why? Because it's based on self-interest. That's the thing you have to fight. You have to defend, if you really want to defend capitalism. The economics are fine, the politics and constitutionalism are fine, but at root, you have to argue for this is humane because it's the system that lets us pursue our self-interest. And then that is not a comfortable argument for a lot of people. I understand that, but that's the only argument I believe that will save us. Let people be themselves. Let people live autonomously. Leave people alone. Stop coercing them. Stop telling them what to inject in their bodies. Stop telling them how to run their business. Stop telling them that some people are essential and others are non-essential. Think of that. The only way you can do that is by saying, I am my own person, leave me alone. I have interests and values and it's my self-interest. And I'm not trying to hurt you, but you need to stop hurting me. You need to leave me alone and let me live my life in the American way, pursuing happiness. I hope that helps.
Right. This is going to be our last question.
Okay.
What is the greatest opportunity for Gen Z to build wealth? Because we are currently being priced out of traditional means like the housing market with the rise of inflation and home prices.
Very good question. I think my only answer to that is invention, meaning use your minds as much as possible, develop your thinking and creative and rational faculties. One of the great things about capitalism, which I didn't mention tonight, is it truly super rewards mental labor, secondarily skilled labor, and in the back of the bus, manual labor. Well, you know that. So manual labor is not the thing most prized under I mean, people get paid for manual labor, they survive and flourish. But if you think of the labor market and that way, manual labor, skilled labor, mental labor, or cerebral labor, the topic can be anywhere from the arts and entertainment, composers, directors, screenwriters. They're cerebral. They're not the ones on stage. They're the one who create play screenplays and things like that. But same thing in science, in R&D, creation. Same thing in business. Who are the minds and great minds of business? CEOs. CEOs and managers, the ones most hated today are precisely the ones who contribute most to the bottom line. You know, Elon Musk. Just brilliant as a manager, brilliant as a technologist. So that's my best advice. I mean, it's not easy to say, you know, be brilliant, be brilliant, stand out, be an entrepreneur, be an R&D trailblazer. What do they call it today? Be a disruptor. But I think the main thing an individualist pro-capitalist philosophy gives you and an egoistic philosophy gives you is try things, be confident, develop your confidence, don't be apologetic. Be like Elon Musk. He's apologizing for no one, right? He's willing to stand up against real opposition. It takes not just backbone and fortitude and courage. It does take intelligence, but you can develop that. This is not gifted. These things have to be developed, and you can do that. And yes, there are things like inflation. There's things like, you know, housing is unaffordable. But the key to a really creative, rational, self-interested person is they find a way. They find a way, and they're not going to take no for an answer. So that, and then find others who will help you. Find other allies. We might be in a minority, but when we find each other, it's very invigorating and it's very moving and inspiring. So that's one of the things I love about capitalism. It is so moral and so practical. And that's why, by the way, it's so sustainable. It's the only system that's all those three things. It's moral because it's egoistic. It's practical because it produces the goods. And everyone knows it's sustainable. It lasts. It survives even with all the slings and arrows from the anti-capitalists. And the socialists, we know, for years and decades, they keep predicting the end of capitalism. And it annoys them to no end that they haven't extinguished it yet. So it's a wonderful system, but think of yourself as a capitalist, same thing. You're moral, you're practical, you're going to sustain yourself, you're going to survive despite all the enemies around you. And then when you do, tell me about it so we can hook up and talk about your great successes.
All right, so that's going to do it for our event, Capitalism, the Optimal Habitat for Humanity. Thank you very much, Dr. Salsman. If anyone wants to read more of Dr. Salsman's material, visit his website, richardsalsman.com, as you can see on the screen, and check out any of his books. Dr. Salsman, thank you for being a great event. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for listening in. Thank you, Abby. Take care, everyone.